And I love the fact that you're calling uh, white supremacy a disorder. And I also like to use the term theft. I think that's very appropriate. And I know in the book you outline the theft of truth, the theft of power, the theft of wealth. Can you talk a little bit about the theft? I think that's a really important point that more Christians need to hear about how white supremacy and racism has been a theft.
Well, we describe uh, theft as the essence and the primary social effect of white supremacy. Uh, Theft, what you might describe biblically as a violation of the eighth commandment, which isn't to say that's all that white supremacy is or does, but that's just one lens through which we can see the evils that it has wrought. And that's really important because when we talk about white supremacy, there are a lot of people that tend to look at that as sort of this nebulous idea and nothing more than an idea. And so to talk about white supremacy and its impact and reparations as connected to it, it's sort of this unintelligible train of thought if you just leap from white supremacy to reparations. No, what makes reparations morally logical is when we can identify that thefts, robberies have been committed. If the problem with racism in America was simply broken relationships, reparations is not the proper solution. The proper solution would be reconciliation, the repair of relationship. Now, that is biblical and that is true. Our argument is that it's not less than that. It's simply more than that. More has happened because of racism. More evil has been perpetrated because of racism than simply that which has resulted in broken relationships or misguided ideas about other image bearers, right? Racist thoughts and attitudes and beliefs. That there actually has been a robbery, as you mentioned, of truth, power, and wealth. And so then what we need to do, as we have tried to do, is open up the Bible and say, well, what has the Bible told us is the proper response to theft? Not the proper response to racism, generically speaking, or the proper response to broken relationships, but to theft. And the answer, I think we discover, is two things, which we describe as the twofold moral logic of reparations. First, the response of restitution, which is that you need to give back what was stolen. And secondly, the response of restoration, which is motivated by neighbor love, to give back to the victim of robbery what was stolen, even if you yourself are not personally culpable. Sort of a surrogate restitutionary role that you play. You give as if you had taken, but you didn't take, but you give anyway, simply out of neighbor love.
And that's a great phrase.
The primary example of that in the scripture is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if your starting point isn't theft, none of the rest of this makes sense.
That's right.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I got to say that was probably one of the most powerful parts of your book when I began to read through the story of the Good Samaritan with a new lens. It was just very, very convicting because that parable speaks to us on so many different levels. But when you layered it with America's sins of racism and white supremacy and discrimination and the Good Samaritan story of like, are you going to let this person pass by? Are you not going to help? Are you not going to try to help heal the situation? I thought you both did a beautiful job like using that parable because that's gospel.
And I just want to point out, Mike, that what the evangelical church traditionally does with that parable is to use it as an example of benevolence ministry, right? Mercy ministry, charity, caring for those that are harmed or hurt on the roadside. And that's true, and that's a proper biblical application of that, one layer of it. But as you mentioned, that appreciating the way in which we use that to sort of unpack some of these racial realities, that is something that's simply learned from Black Christians, right? The way that Dr. King taught that parable time and again in his ministry, in his public life, the way that Toni Morrison, the example that was used also in that chapter, uses it as sort of a framework to refigure the atrocities of antebellum slavery. This is also something that filled the imagination of Howard Thurman. Again and again, if we pay attention to the way that African American Christians have read scripture, ta-da, there it is. And we say that, I mentioned that simply to say, again, that the book itself is an attempt to model the kind of apprenticing ourselves underneath the leadership of Black Christians, Black ministry leaders, Black thinkers, Black activists, to learn something that has heretofore been obscured to the white evangelical imagination. There's a treasure trove of spiritual realities that we have not yet seen, that we need to start to encounter collectively, and to learn from our Black brothers and sisters.
I'm curious about the critics to this Christian view of reparations you presented in this book. What are they missing?
I think when I was talking earlier about the kind of concentric nature of the responses, that different people don't have different pieces in place. Some are missing, frankly, historical knowledge about what has happened in this country, and they have a very distorted view of American history and the impact of American racism on millions of people's lives. I think some folks are missing like basic historical knowledge on this. Some people are missing an awareness of our own theological tradition, and I think that's what we try to point out in chapters 4 through 6. Some people are missing that. I would say, though, that there are two things that are most troubling to me in what I see, and one is a lack of self-criticism. I think they're missing the capacity to self-criticize, and how many it has been not surprising. It's in some ways the most predictable thing in the world, given what we've written in the book. But it is distressing to see how many Christians who do love God and want to love their neighbors, they speak about this before they are ready, and they seem not to know that. And that's one thing that is missing. And the other thing, frankly, that I think is probably probably the worst thing, because it's one thing to not be aware of yourself. It's a whole other thing to not be aware of your neighbors. And I would say that what they're missing is tears. I would say what they're missing is empathy. I am frankly astonished, and I shouldn't be, but I am, by the degree to which people will take this issue on as an alleged thought leader and have apparently zero recognition of how brutal the pain has been, and that it continues to be, how deep the discouragement is in African American communities in this country, how difficult every day is in light of the things that they see. It is so lack of self-knowledge, yes, but the lack of empathy and tears is deeply discouraging to me, and I think that for me is what is missing. And I, in some ways, want to say I don't think people should be talking about this until they have been willing to weep over the reality of American history.
Yeah, and I'd simply add to that latter point, Greg, proximity to Black neighbors, friends, and Black Christians, right? And this isn't universally the case, but oftentimes those that are most resistant simply are isolated from the lived realities found in the Black community. There's a confidence that's unfounded. there's a confidence in
exactly
their,
right.
Like even strangely the audacity to speak on behalf of Black people, right? As if we know. Absent of real relationships, I think that leads to empathy and weeping, right? Like I wouldn't care so deeply personally if I wasn't staring into the faces of dear friends with whom I weep about all other kinds of things, right? So you're just bound up together in life and love and sorrow and grief of all kinds. And so when you speak on these things, or when you read these things, or you address these things, it's never just an analytical exercise. It's never theoretical. There's flesh and blood realities that are always tied to them. And that doesn't mean you agree on everything, but it certainly changes the tone and tenor of how you talk about it. and that's why it's almost without fail easy to read how people respond to it, whether they are surrounded by Black folks or a Black community. And obviously I'm talking about more than just the token, I've got that Black friend. but someone that's in your heart, someone that you carry with you. There's no other way forward apart from that.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado Podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.